Welcome to week 6, video 1 for PSC 355, and in this video we're going to be discussing sovereign debt. The central question we want to answer is why and how do governments get into debt, and what if they can't pay it back? So what are we talking about? We're talking about external sovereign debt, money owed by a government to a foreign entity. This entity could be a bank, a bondholder, a foreign government, or another international financial institution like the IMF. Any foreign entity that a government owes money to would classify as sovereign debt. This is the promise by the government to pay back the principal, the amount it borrowed, plus any interest and fees. External sovereign lending is the opposite of this, loans by any entity to a foreign government. So a bank lending money to the government of the United Kingdom, for instance, would classify as external sovereign lending. Now, why do countries get into external debt? Well, they might do it because of limited domestic capital. There may not be enough money within the economy to fund the government spending, so they have to look abroad. Governments borrow in general because it allows them to allow spending to exceed revenue temporarily at least. Eventually they may have to pay this back, but in the short term they're able to spend more than they earn, and that means they can fund things like investment projects that promote growth in the long run, things like maybe building a road or building an airport, etc., that may not want to pay for in the short term, but in the long run could help pay off big time. So how do countries get into debt? Today, the main way is through government bond auctions. Governments literally go out and say, dear international markets, financial markets, we want to borrow X amount of dollars for this amount of period of time. How much will you charge us? Bonds are an IOU. Maturities vary. You might borrow for 3 months, you might borrow for 9 months, you might borrow for 10 years. Borrowing isn't free. That's the key point here. And governments are charged interest rates, and the price that they're charged is determined by markets. If there's a lot of buyers for a government's debt, well, that means you're going to probably have a lower interest rate. If there are very few buyers, the government's going to have to promise to pay back more to get someone to be interested. Take a minute and listen to this clip, which will help summarize and explain a little bit more how governments borrow through bond auctions. Oops. Let's go back to that 1 second here.
From today's buying spree on Wall Street, we turn to another mainstay of the economy, a process that happens every week and gets much less attention. I'm talking about Treasury bond auctions. All right, hold on. Before you turn the dial, this is Treasury bond auctions through the eyes of Adam Davidson of NPR's Planet Money team. He says they're not as boring as they sound. In fact, he says they just may hold the key to nearly everything happening in the global economy. And Adam joins us now from New York. And Adam, today you actually were watching the auctions held for 4-week and 52-week Treasury bonds, whatever that means. What's so fascinating about these sales?
Well, at Planet Money, we study all these financial crises going on all over the world. Obviously here in the U.S. with the sequester and our slow economic recovery, in Europe, the many financial crises we keep hearing about, and then also all sorts of smaller crises in Asia and Latin America and Africa. And what we have learned, much at first to our deep chagrin, is that the single thing that helps you understand how to compare these different crises is government bond interest rates. That interest rate tells you at a glance how the global pool of investors, this giant global pool of money, thinks about the relative risks of all of these different crises all over the world. And where do those numbers come from? More than anything, the single most important one is the U.S. Treasury bond auction. Exactly what happened today, like it does 1, 2, 3 times a week, every week.
So what do these auctions actually look like, and what exactly are they auctioning off?
I was once invited to an auction. A bond dealer invited me to an auction. I got all excited. I thought, should I wear a suit? What does one wear to an auction? Turns out nothing like that at all. This is just a bunch of dealers all over the world sitting at computer screens typing. In fact, while the auction was happening, I was all nervous and excited, and the trader was talking to me, and then he turned and typed a few keys on his keyboard, turned back to me, and a few minutes later I said, when's the auction? He goes, oh, when I typed, that was the auction. That's all it is. But basically what it is the U.S. government, as we famously know, has to borrow a lot of money. They borrow it in different increments. So they go out to the world's investors and say, hey, we want to borrow money from you. How much will you charge us in interest to borrow from you? And that's a competitive process. It's an auction. And today they wanted to borrow $45 billion for 4 weeks. They went out to the world's banks and said, hey, What do we have to pay you to lend us $45 billion?
So what was it like today? What was the bidding?
The bidding was among the lowest interest rates ever in history. What that tells you is the investors basically said, we will give you $45 billion and you have to give us almost nothing back. To be precise, these world investors were saying, we're going to lend the US government $100 for a month, and all we want back is 6/10 of a penny in a month.
All right, so that gives you a sense of how bond auctions actually work. Now, why do creditors lend abroad? Well, creditors are interested in lending abroad for a couple of reasons. One is that they might be chasing higher returns. We discussed this in our previous discussion about capital flows. You might be moving your money abroad, even lending to a foreign government, because you expect a greater return. You're going to get a higher interest rate. So you want to make more money off your investment. But governments also lend abroad to chase what we might call safety. So lending money to the U.S. government, because the U.S. government has never failed to pay back its creditors, is viewed as a safe investment. And so let's say you're about to retire. You'd probably want to put your money in government bonds like the U.S. or say German government bonds, because you want to make sure you don't lose that money. And so chasing safety is another reason investors will move their money abroad. Individuals and creditors have to balance these benefits against some risks, however. Lending takes place in what we would call anarchy. There is no central authority that governs international finance that can essentially enforce loan contracts. So if a foreign government borrows money from you and decides at one point they want to renegotiate the deal and pay back less than they promised, you can't take that foreign government to court and force them to pay you. So there's a great risk. Their biggest risk is that a foreign government may actually default, may just stop making payments to you, and so you could lose your investment. Just like individuals, governments can borrow too much money. Debts can spiral out of control, and the government may become unable or unwilling to pay back its creditors. This is an important distinction: inability versus unwillingness to pay. Walter Wriston, the former CEO of Citigroup, a major American bank, once said, countries don't go bust. The basic point he was making is that you can lend money to a corporation and the corporation could go bankrupt and cease to exist next year. But countries rarely cease to exist. They don't go bust. They don't go bankrupt. With enough austerity, enough significant spending cuts and revenue increases, almost all countries could pay back their debts. However, just because countries don't go bust doesn't mean they're always willing to pay back their debts. Sometimes governments have to weigh the social and political costs as well as the economic considerations in making decisions about paying back their debts. So there's always the potential for debtor and creditor conflict. Lenders and borrowers both benefit from the international financial system, but lenders want to maximize their returns, they want all the money they were promised, and debtors may want to give back as little as possible. So, debtors have a bargaining tool. They may threaten to default after the deal has been made in an effort to get a reduced, in an effort to get, for instance, the principal reduced or a lower interest rate. Lenders, on the other hand, they have a key bargaining tool, which is to threaten to cut off future lending. Look, if you burn us today and don't pay us back today, we're not going to lend to you in the future when you need money. If it's a government that's owed money that's being negotiated with, it may threaten to say cut off foreign aid or even threaten military action. Now, this doesn't happen much today, but it has historically in the past. Just to make things clear, if a government defaults on its debts, what does this really mean? Well, it means that in practice, the default is probably only partial, and it typically occurs after long negotiations. Governments may reschedule their debt, where the debtor forces its creditor to accept a longer repayment schedule or interest rate concessions, as we just discussed. This is still considered a default. Anytime the creditor doesn't get back everything they were promised, it classifies as a default. When these episodes occur, these are generally referred to as international debt crises, right? Because we have an impasse. A creditor, a bank, or a bondholder is promised money and a government is trying to pay back less and renegotiate that deal and break that contract. You're reading about these this week. The Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s is a classic example of this. Russia had a financial crisis in the 1990s. And if you watch the news today, you'll probably hear what's going on with Greece in particular. It's facing its own debt crisis today as well.